Hello and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Production channel here at YouTube, and welcome to another album of the week. This is episode number 108, and for this week's pick for this episode, well, since I had at least announced this at the very end of the last album of the week episode, which was episode number 107, which was for the second full-length album from Tigers of Pantang, that was Spellbound. And of course I did announce this on episode number 15 of the Nasty Metal podcast. It is the debut studio full-length album from, well, another new wave or British heavy metal band. It is The World's Insane from Vardis, which originally was released at least in some time of April of 1981, and since we are pretty much at the tail end of April, it has already reached its 40th anniversary, and it just seemed right to definitely to at least make this a album of the week episode, and of course an album of the week for this channel. It's a great spotlight anyways. And I've been wanting to at least talk about more Vardis on this channel anyways, because of these guys don't seem to get a whole lot of topic or discussion. They always, it's like you usually, you might get some people that might talk about Vardis, but for the most part they get, at times I feel, overshadowed by the likes of either Def Leppard, Saxon, Tigers of Pantang, Raven, Venom, and I think that there's also, or Samson, Tokyo Blade, you know, just to really name some, they tend to really those bands overshadow Vardis in some cases, and yet Vardis were there from the beginning in some ways. I mean, let's look at the background for these guys. They were a three-piece. Again, they were at least from Wakefield, West Yorkshire, England, and they were originally formed back in 1973 as Quo Vardis, which was to at least for Steve Zodiac to pay tribute to Status Quo, but eventually changing the name to just shortening to Vardis in 1977, and that's pretty much where everything will lead into. But these guys, at least Steve Zodiac, has been in the rock scene, or at least playing in the underground, since the early 70s. So these guys just, again, didn't really get a whole lot of recognition for some reason, I feel like, but they've been there around the beginning, probably like Saxon, who were around that same period too, was also going by the name Son of a Bitch. So they were there from the beginning, really one of the oldest, at least just one of the oldest pieces to the new wave or British heavy metal movement. But anyways, let's definitely talk about more beginnings about this band before I go into any of just everything that's talk about everything that leads up to The World's Insane. So let's definitely begin there. Since I already just mentioned it, that these guys, at least Steve Zodiac, had originally formed this band back in 1973 under the name Quo Vardis, and of course then changing it, or again shortening the name to just Vardis in 1977. And so, since I really can't find any definitive lineup from when they were under the name Quo Vardis, so I don't know who was in the band before, if it had been a 4-piece or a 5-piece, or it had always been a 3-piece. I can't find any of that information, it seems like. I've been on Metal Archives, and I've been on Wikipedia, even on Discogs, and there's no other information about the lineup as Quo Vardis. So the only thing that you can find is at least a lineup that began in 1977, which was basically Steve Zodiac on guitar and vocals, Tony Bolton on bass, and Phil Medley on drums. And Tony Bolton, I think, would end up leaving the band in 1979, then at least to be a part of the band Mendes Prey. Yeah, another new wave of British heavy metal band. Let me see real quick on if he had. Yeah, he would actually end up playing bass on the Borderline single from 1982. So he had been in the band Mendes Prey in 1981. So there we go. So he definitely had left because of he ain't on any other recordings. It doesn't seem to be on any recordings for Vardis. So he definitely had to at least left, and eventually he got replaced by Alan Selway, and that pretty much leads us to the first lineup, or at least the first lineup to really record anything. So this would be the 100 miles per hour EP, which was released in October of 1979 through Red Ball Records, and it was only at least limited to at least 2,000 copies. Yeah, and so there we go, and it was a 3-track EP, and it was, or no, 4-track EP, excuse me, which we had 100 miles per hour, which would get recorded for the live record, which I'll get to here, Blue Rock, Destiny, and of course, The World's Insane, which the track The World's Insane would end up being used as the title track for their debut studio album, and of course, Blue Rock would end up being re-recorded for that album. So there we go. Leaving songs like 100 miles per hour and Destiny kind of obscure in this case. So again, the lineup for here was Steve Zodiac, Alan Selway, and Phil Medley. But this would not last, because Phil Medley would then leave the band afterwards and would get replaced by Gary Pearson. So this becomes pretty much the lineup for now. And the lineup, of course, this pretty much leads into the 100 miles per hour live album, which was actually pretty much their first record. Yes, their first record was a live record. Again, for any of those who may be unfamiliar with Vardis, you're getting at least most of your information from me, or unless you always can look up this on yourself, or at least by yourself on anywhere else. Alright, so again, they released their live album, which there's not any date on when it was released, but it was at least in 1980. And it is definitely a classic live record. I know some bands, normally it's weird to release a live album as your first record. I mean, A to Z with the Witch of Berkeley had their very first record was a live record, and it's their only full record anyways. But when at least trying to say which album's better, miles ahead, 100 miles per hour is by far probably the best debut live record in at least in any band. If you ask me, for any band, it's one of the best debut live records. Good album. Or at least a live album that is a debut album for a band, not really a great first live record. Okay, let's definitely at least get that correct. Okay, all right. So after that, they then released a whole bunch of other singles with this lineup of basically Steve Zodiac, Alan Selway, and Gary Pearson. This lineup would then release a whole bunch of 7-inches throughout at least 1980 after the 100 miles per hour live album. I mean, Blue Rock, I Miss You with Dirty Money as the B-side, Let's Go, and Situation Negative as the B-side, Too Many People with Lion's Share as the B-side, If I Were a King, which is a classic track. That was even featuring on definitely one of the most crowning or up there as one of the most influential compilation albums in the new wave or British heavy metal movement, that being the New Electric Warriors compilation. So that's where If I Were King was pretty much found on, well, at least for most people who probably was discovering Vardis, besides just probably finding their 7-inches in the 7-inch pile in the record stores. So there. And then, of course, the very last single to be released in 1980 was that was the very last single, was If I Were King, with Out of the Way on as the B-side. Then finally beginning, the first thing they released in 1981 was a 7-inch, which was their cover of, or at least their first version of their cover of Hawkwind's Silver Machine, which would then get re-recorded for the debut full-length album, The World's Insane. And then on the B-side is a very obscure track called Come On, which is actually a great track. It gets stated as live, but it's a studio track with live audience noise piped into the studio track. Kind of like with Def Leppard with the album version of Rocks Off. So there we go. And then, of course, releasing their second EP in 1981 titled All You'll Ever Need, which the track listing for this EP was, again, on the A side, All You'll Ever Need. And then on the B-side, If I Were King, and their cover of the Rolling Stones, Jumping Jack Flash. And then there was a promo EP that was released in 1981 after that. And this is probably a promo EP to at least to promote the World's Insane album, which the track listing here would be Police Patrol, All You'll Ever Need, Power Underfoot, and then Money Grabber. So finally, they apparently then released a compilation in 1981 called Metal Power. I guess that this had to have been sometime after, after The World's Insane. So let's finally get into The World's Insane. Let's get into this album, shall we? Since I've already went through a lot of the everything leading up to this album, let's get to it. Alright, so The World's Insane. This album was recorded from at least January to February of 1981 at Rock City, Shepperton Studios in London, UK. And of course, we have at least extra vocals and piano stuff being recorded at Olympic Studios in London, UK. And it was mixed at the Nova Suite, London, UK. And then finally, it was released sometime in April of 1981 through the Logo Records label. So here we are. And of course, the album right here was produced by Nicholas Raymond, which this would be the final thing he would produce for the band. He had been producing their stuff since the 100 Miles Per Hour live album. And so this would be the final thing he would produce for the band. And of course, this album was engineered by Nick Smith, or here he is named Nick Tornado Smith. And he had been producing stuff for plenty of bands like Persian Risk, for the Calling For You single, the new wave for British heavy metal band Storm Queen, which High Roller Records did a compilation album of. And then finally, he would then engineer this album for Vardis, and he would also then be the producer for the follow-up album, Quo Vardis. So there we go. And so I guess we can then go on for photography is Lee Conister, and then Paul Shave, who is the one behind design and the artwork for this album. So here we go. We got about 10 songs for this album, and it all clocks in at 35 minutes and 43 seconds. Perfect length for a new wave or British heavy metal album, if you ask me. So these 10 songs are Power Underfoot, Money Grabber, the title track, Blue Rock, I Miss You, Silver Machine, which is a Hawkwind cover, Police Patrol, All You'll Ever Need, Curse the Gods, or actually it is titled Curse of the Gods on my copy of the World Has Gone Mad compilation CD. Love Is Dead, and then finally ending with Steamin' Along. Where do I begin? If you're not familiar with the new wave or British heavy metal movement, or you're just new to this is a good album to also get you in, because of this really captures plenty of the spirit of the new wave or British heavy metal movement. It's got a lot of that fury intensity that a lot of those bands had, like either Diamond Head, which is another band I failed to mention when a band that usually gets talked about a lot than Vardis. But it captures the intensity of that, and other bands like either Samson and just Tigers of Pantang and Raven, Tank, whatnot. You got plenty of that intensity, but it still has its own unique feel. It still is. Again, one of the things that when I first got into Vardis, I'll have to really be honest with you, it took me years to really appreciate. Because when I first heard these guys, I really thought they were a little too boogie from my taste at the time. But I think getting back into bands like AC/DC, then getting into like Rose Tattoo and The Angels, and just some of those other sort of rock, just straight up rock and roll kind of bands. Be quite honest, I think Vardis is where, to me, getting back to these guys is where everything really clicked just the most, and I just began to really appreciate. But at the same time, I don't know if I would consider Vardis to be straight up boogie rock, but they take a lot of that. But it still has a very fury to it, and in this album, I mean, coming off the heels of a live record, this is still, in many ways, it's got the same intensity and feel of a live record in some cases. Even though it is a studio album, and many will definitely say that most studio albums don't really capture the essence of how they do when they are playing live, or especially a live version, because of it's all about that raw energy and that youthful playing and so on. I think for a studio album and that is coming off the heels of a live record, they still were able to really retain that energy and capture it in the studio, because of this is still raw, just straight up fury, new wave or British heavy metal, just rock and roll in its primal capacity, in its primal state. Just straight up great stuff. I mean, just beginning with the track Power Underfoot, to then other sort of, again, showing their blues rock roots with Money Grabber, and then The World's Insane being the title track, and then other tracks, even in some cases, I might even say All You'll Ever Need might be the most British glam rock influenced track on this album, maybe along with Police Patrol. But songs like, again, even like Love Is Dead and Steaming Along, there's just plenty of just straight up rockers on this album. That's the thing. And of course, they do a supercharged version of Hawkwind Silver Machine. And between which versions I like, between the album version or the 7-inch version of this version of, or at least of their recording of Silver Machine, I don't know. I think I might, though, prefer the album version, because it just has a little heaviness to it compared to the 7-inch version. But it's still there. If there's anyone that's ever going to do at least a track like Silver Machine justice, it would probably be Vardis here, because of, again, they just have that power to them. Many ways, Vardis were really a band you really would put next to bands like Motorhead or Tank, or even, and in some cases too, Tank, I guess, I might have, or Raven, actually, I meant to say Raven, because of, again, it's just straight up, no BS, in your face, rock and roll, meant the way. I mean, in many ways, Steve Zodiac, and really, I do want to take some time to really also give some appreciation to this guy, because of, he doesn't get enough appreciation, because of, to me, he's probably one of the standout guitar players from at least the new wave or British heavy metal movement. And normally when you think of guitar players, you normally don't think of the new wave or British heavy metal movement as most of the time. You only just think of bands that are really guitar players. But Steve Zodiac is probably the biggest probably the biggest star when it comes to at least Vardis. It's like he's pretty much the overall essence of this band. And in some cases, his guitar playing, to me, he definitely gives Ted Nugent a run for his money of just being a wild axeman. What just a powerhouse player. And his vocals, though, at times, I almost find to be a little punkish in some cases, but I wouldn't really say Vardis or at least are punk, but they or even at least close to that. It's still very much rock and roll, or at least 70s, what people consider 70s heavy metal in heart and soul, but still the way, I mean, the thing is, Vardis really took the sort of the roots of like the British rock and roll stuff of like either the Rolling Stones and Slade and of course Status Quo and maybe even T-Rex, or some of these bands, and just decide to put a heavy metal drive around this sound, which just gives it its overall power and just makes it just super overdriven. It's like bands like AC/DC or Ted Nugent really definitely took the sort of Chuck Berry style rock and roll of the 1950s, but supercharged it in the 70s. But Vardis takes whatever those bands are doing and even supercharges it even more, on almost being on the same level as like Motorhead. The only difference is Steve Zodiac's vocals aren't really close to being like Lemmy. He just has a more melodic vocals that is very British in its own vibe. It's just, it's still new wave or British heavy metal, but it just has such a fiery feel around it. And I think it's why I've become to really say that Vardis might be one of my favorite new wave or British heavy metal bands. Like, these guys are just straight up rock and roll in the way that it's meant to be. Just great stuff. And again, I just love it. I mean, just songs again like Power Underfoot and Curse of the Gods, Love Is Dead, and Steaming Along are just straight up powerhouse rockers, whereas Money Grabber is just a straight up, just down and dirty, boogie, bluesy, freaking heavy track that I just fucking love. And the thing is, there is at least some guest harmonica on this one, which is actually provided by a guy named Judd Lander, who provides the harmonica to this one, which for some reason I can't help but think of Aerosmith for some reason. I don't know. It's like I almost feel like this wouldn't be too out of place to like either Rocks or Toys in the Attic in terms of just the overall feel, but it's just more intense in some cases too. It's just fucking fantastic. But he also, this guy here, Judd Lander, also provides the bagpipes for Police Patrol, which again, I guess to get to these songs, Police Patrol and All You'll Never Need, they're definitely probably the most British, again, sounding. Again, very much inspired by a lot of their British rock contemporaries of the late 60s, early 1970s, that sort of glam rock period. They definitely do take a lot of that influence and really do infuse it into their sound on this album, for sure. And it actually does give it a little overall uniqueness. I mean, a lot of the new wave of British heavy metal bands from like at least 1979 to at least 1981 did take a lot of influence from all the British glam rock bands of the period. They really did. But they just made it a little bit heavier in some cases, a little rawer. But it's still, you can tell where the influences were coming from. So that's one of the things that I really tend to really, at least too familiar with. But just good stuff. And All You'll Ever Need, I don't know if I would call a ballad, but it is probably the most where it could have been a radio hit. Because it just has that overall feel of it, but it didn't. But it's a good track. I do like it a lot. It's definitely the more melodic songs on the album that really isn't a straight up razor blade edged hard rocker. So it's just good stuff. And of course, again, songs like Blue Rock, I Miss You is a straight up boogie rocker that I also like too. And then Silver Machine, their Hawkwind cover is also great. So I really can't say. I just almost love all of it. I mean, again, this band coming off the heels of a live album, they really are taking that energy and are just really are capturing it the best in the studio here. It's like they got them when they were just hot. That's all, and it's just fantastic. Just a great album. So I really can't say anything else, really. I think it's just a fantastic record, and it's just a good album that really captures that period, that youthful period of the early new wave or British heavy metal era of 1979 to at least 1981 or 82. Because at least after this, you can tell some bands would start to flirt a little bit with commercial sound, or at least trying to be more accessible. And I think after this, I think Vardis would then kind of go a little bit of that direction on the next album. So that's where we then lead after this. Because after this one, they of course would do plenty of shows. They would tour. And I think the bands they might have toured with, I can't really name right now because I haven't really looked to see any bands who they might have played with. I think they did play like the Rating Festival or so on. They did. If you ask me personally, since to go back to my sort of discussion or at least my thoughts I had kind of given on August 1981 Monsters of Rock Festival, because I had kind of mentioned about More being on there, who was another new wave or British heavy metal band. And the thing is, I always kind of made the argument how it's kind of odd that band was chosen over, let's say, a band like Vardis, who I think would have benefited more from playing on a lineup with those heavy hitters like Whitesnake, like Blue Oyster Cult, like Blackfoot, and Slade, a band that you can tell, I think a band like Vardis really at least really held in high in terms of some of their influences. But and of course then AC/DC. I think Vardis would have benefited more from playing on that festival than More, because More after that, it seemed like there was a struggle with them in terms of trying to get any sort of notoriety. Even when they were on Atlantic, they didn't get any sort of beneficial in return. Nothing. I think Vardis would have benefited more from at least a festival like that, because you could tell with an album like this, they would have been perfect for a Monsters of Rock. Because if they were just playing this sound in front of that big of a crowd at Donington Park, that would have been, I think, what would have been done great for Vardis. Because again, then they would have been at least had more. I think the eye would have been put on them in some cases too. They would have been the like the wild card on that lineup. And I think in many ways, some of those bands probably would have took them on tour with them, and that's why I think it would have been fantastic for at least a band like Vardis. They were just live ready, and they would have just fed off that crowd. They would have. So for me personally, if I was to put that festival together in today with that same lineup, I would have took away more and would have put in Vardis instead. So that's how I would have booked that festival, the Monsters of Rock 1981 festival. So that's only fantasy booking right there. That's fantasy festival booking, and I would have at least would have done it like that. But that's all it is. It's fantasy booking. So all right. Then, so this was it. After this album, they would tour for it, and then they would head back in the studio to record Cult Vardis, and that's where we lead things off, because I'll save my thoughts for whenever I talk about the follow-up studio album to the World's Insane Cult Vardis. So, with that, this album was originally released on April of 1981. If you have any sort of memories of this album, did you grow up when this album was first released? Did you grow up when you probably first found out about Vardis? Did you find out about him some years later and you went and picked up this record? And if you have any memories of listening to this album, or have any thoughts of listening to this album, and if you have any thoughts of when you first heard it, or when you might have given it several chances, again, if you have any thoughts, whether they be at least positive or negative, you can leave them in the comments section below. But if you have just any nostalgic memories, you can leave them in the comment section below. Alright, but if you haven't listened to this album, if you want to get into Vardis, this album, or I would say 100 Miles Per Hour, the live album, are just great starting points for Vardis. Of course, they would keep going, and that would be it. So there we go. Alright, because I'm going to save some of my rest of my stuff for at least the follow album and whatnot. Alright, so that's it for episode number 108 of the Album of the Week episode. So, what's going to be next week's Album of the Week episode? Let's get into that. What's going to be the band, or at least the album that's going to be that I'm picking for episode number 109 of Album of the Week? Let's see. That, of course, would come out on May the 2nd. What's the album? It is Difficult to Cure from Rainbow. That's going to be an interesting one. Alright, so that's going to be next week's Album of the Week pick. So with that, I hope all of you enjoyed. I hope all of you might be looking forward to that one. So with that, this is Terry Thrasher. Say I'm out. And I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.